Hello, in this episode of Airs for Architecture, I spoke with Jane Rendell, Professor in Critical Spatial Practice at the Bartlett School of Architecture, University College London, about her book The Architecture of Psychoanalysis, Spaces of Transition, republished this year by Bloomsbury.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of A is for Architecture. I'm talking today to Professor Jane Rendell. Jane, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself, please?
Hi Ambrose. Hi everyone listening. Very lovely to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me. The really nice thing that you're doing here, Ambrose, getting people to talk about books they've written. It's I think it really is a way into architectural theory that is quite approachable. I mean, I love reading interviews with philosophers and theorists about their work and find that really helps me get into kind of why they're doing things and what they're up to. So I really appreciate this opportunity. Yeah, it's difficult to kind of know quite how to introduce myself in terms of where to start. But I realized this morning, thinking about the interview, that one of the things that I think becomes quite palpable in the book we're going to discuss is that I was born in Dubai to a hydrogeologist dad, Londoner, and a Welsh mum who's a French and Spanish teacher, retired now. My dad passed away a few years ago. And we moved a lot in my childhood. We moved from Dubai to Sudan, Ethiopia, Afghanistan. My dad was a hydrogeologist, so irrigation projects. And I think that sense of moving around and kind of trying to find a place or being out of place, being unsettled, has actually informed quite a lot of what I do as a writer, but also as a researcher and educator. So my work is definitely inter or transdisciplinary. I work across many fields. I trained originally in architecture. I studied at Sheffield and at Edinburgh, and then worked in social housing, and then very briefly for Matrix, the architecture feminist cooperative, in the 90s, and then became so interested in feminist theory. I looked at feminist theory and architecture in my undergrad dissertation at Sheffield, but then just really wanted to develop that. So I did a master's in architectural history at UCL, and then a PhD at Birkbeck in the art school there, supervised by Professor Lynn Need. And I was really looking at how feminist theory can offer different ways of doing architectural history, the practice of architectural history. So, kind of what we choose to study and how we choose to study it in terms of interpretive models, but also how we write about architectural history. So different types of writing practice. And that was always kind of paralleled, I guess, with my role as a teacher, as a pedagogue. Though I spent the first few jobs that I had as an academic while I was doing my PhD were actually in art schools. So I was in Winchester College of Art, which was a brilliant place to be in the 90s, a really small and amazing art school. And it had this textile art bachelor's run by a brilliant textile artist called Shelley Goldsmith. And I taught history theory on that, which I absolutely loved. And I think sometimes that interest in textility and the weaving of strands is something that's very much in my own writing practice. And I also taught at Chelsea College of Art and Design. I started teaching on, but then became the director of the MA in the theory and practice of public art and design. And that was set up by a psychoanalyst, an artist called Faye Carey. So I think there's also in that background, the way that Faye understood the relation of theory and practice from a psychoanalytic perspective rather than an architectural perspective, I think has been quite formative for me as well. So while I was at Chelsea, that was just one of those really enriching pedagogical experiences. The master's was a very small master's, like a 2-year master's, part-time, 12 students per year, came from all kinds of backgrounds. And we were kind of reinventing public art practice as site-specific practice. And that was where I kind of came up with the idea of critical spatial practice and site writing, which I've continued onwards in my teaching and what I do today at the Bartlett School of Architecture, where I'm based.
Amazing introduction. Thank you so much. I mean, so comprehensive and clear. I just wanted to pick up on two things, two comments that you made, and I think one of them seems rather obvious in that you talked about the idea of a feminist architectural historiography and theory. And we all sort of kind of accept that. Everybody believes that. Everybody desires that. I'm not sure as many people know actually what you might mean. So I was just wondering, in what way, I suppose, is or has architectural history been sexed, male, and what does this feminist practice of historiography look like? And obviously, we do want to get across to your book, The Architecture of Psychoanalysis, Spaces of Transition, which you're bringing out with Bloomsbury in a reprint, but I just think that this might be quite a useful way in.
Sure, definitely. I mean, just to clarify, actually, the architecture of psychoanalysis is kind of a sequel to Sight Writing, the architecture of art criticism. So it's actually the Sight Writing book that I'm in discussion with Bloomsbury about in terms of a sequel. But I'll explain the chronology here in relation to your question about feminist architectural history, which is a great one. So I think a kind of feminist critique of architectural history can happen in many different ways and has happened differently over its historical development. The first book that I did, The Pursuit of Pleasure, which was focused on 1820s London, kind of sets out some of that at the beginning. And that work that I was doing, which was part of my PhD, was running concurrent with a book that Ian Borden, Barbara Penner and I brought out, which was a collation of kind of core texts across different disciplines called Gender Space Architecture, but it also told a kind of history of feminism and a history of feminism in architecture. And I'm less sure as time goes by that this is a straightforward history of moving from kind of canon breaking to inventing new methods. I think inventing new methods has been there in a way from the start. But when I first became interested in it, when I was an architecture student at Sheffield in the mid-80s, there were only really two books on the topic: Doris Cole's From Teepee to Skyscraper and Suzanne Torres' book on women in American architecture. And so to learn more about how women had contributed as designers or as kind of users or clients, one had to kind of look across into other disciplines, particularly anthropology and geography, to start thinking about, one wanted to think about how space is produced. You needed to kind of go into those disciplines, which are more kind of spatial practice, spatial theory disciplines than architecture. But I think in architecture, there's been amazing work kind of uncovering the history of women architects, really important scholars, groundbreaking scholars like Alice Friedman's work, and Beatrice Colomina in the States. And then in the UK, we had a whole set of books come out in the early 90s, late 90s. Francesca Hughes, Reconstructing Her Practice, was one. The Brilliant Desiring Practices with Katerina Rudi and Sarah Wigglesworth, which was an exhibition at the RIBA, and also a book with Duncan McCorkadale, which was in the late 90s also. And what those projects did was start to think about methodology. So I was doing my PhD at that very time and became really interested in the idea of architectural history as a practice. I think that was because that was my formative training as a practitioner. I only came to study historiography a bit later. So from the start, I thought of history as a practice, as something that we do. So as well as thinking about how to kind of retrieve lost histories of either women as architects in the way that the male canon defines them, or in adjunct fields, be it interiors, textiles, landscape, or women as patrons, or women producing space as users. There was also the question of what constitutes a valid object of study. So my colleague Barbara Penn has done a huge amount of work on that. Her early work was on toilets. people are like, oh, that's a bit abject, a bit strange. Why are you looking at toilets? And she's like, well, because they're absolutely essential to kind of social functioning. So she was looking at these kind of quite abject objects and saying, no, they're really important for understanding architectural history. My interest was a little bit different because I was so informed by the work of the French feminist philosopher Luce Irigaray and an essay she wrote called Women on the Market, which was a critique of Marxist theories of consumption and looking at the exchange of women in the kind of patriarchal market of exchange. So I started using her theoretical work to think about 1820s London, the sort of commodity capitalism in its early shopping form of arcades, the kind of visual consumption, display of people on the street and in public spaces like theatres and exchanges. So I started to think about the difference between male ways of looking and moving and female ways as they were represented in these texts that were called rambling texts at the time. I mean, it's very, looking back on that work, I've kind of reflected on it quite recently, on the kind of race blindness in the work that I did then. I was looking very much at a feminist Marxist approach. I don't think it looks enough at, I look at homosociality, but I don't really use queer theory. I'm kind of deconstructing the public-private sphere argument to look at women in public space, but I don't deconstruct the binary from a queer perspective. And I think early work that I did could have learned from that. And I also think the new work that I'm doing to look at people of colour in London in the 1820s and how they featured in these rambling texts, it's just unearthing such amazing stuff. But what I was really trying to look at in that book was, how do we do our job as feminists when we're interpreting architectural history, architectural objects? So that's a contribution to methodology, and I think many people are doing that. And then there's also the sense of, how do you take your own position as a feminist? And this then learns from the work of people like Donna Haraway and situated knowledge, to take into account your own situatedness and your own positionality, to self-reflect on that. And I mean, in a way, that's what generated my practice of site writing, was as a form of situated criticism or history. And I think what we see in today's moment of feminist architectural history is a just incredible flourishing, actually, of that as a sort of subdiscipline of architectural history, where a lot of today's scholars are going back to look and retrieve important objects of study for feminist architectural history, like the work of female architects, but they're also doing it with really innovative methodologies. I mean, I've just been looking actually for an essay that I'm writing about the work of a historian and artist called Nora Rendell, and the work that she's done on on the Farnsworth house, Edith Farnsworth. And she's doing it through poetry and installation practice in the house itself. So I think feminist architectural history is in a really good place at the moment in terms of inventive, innovative methodologies. Yeah.
And so this idea of the situated practice and this kind of critical methodological approach, is the idea of this to, in a way, remove the unrealistic binary between the viewer and the viewed, and instead start to better understand the kind of co-constitutive relationship between the two things? I mean, what is the, I guess, very simply, what is the outcome of this as compared to what we might describe as a male-dominated form of historiography?
I think that's a great question. I think you have to kind of, in a way, perhaps, to get to that outcome, maybe think a little bit about the early feminist thinking around situated knowledge. So, you know, the most kind of referred to text on this is Donna Haraway's essay on this from 88, I think, which is a little bit unfair because there were a lot of other brilliant so-called post-structuralists or postmodern feminists working across the fields of kind of philosophy and social sciences in that period. Jane Flax's work, which I've been revisiting recently, which actually has a huge amount to say on transitional spaces, which I don't refer to in the Architecture of Psychoanalysis book, and kind of wish that I had, because I was reading Jane Flax along with Donna Haraway. Jane Flax came up with the idea of standpoint theory. So feminists were trying to make sense of post-structuralist theory and postmodern theory in terms of what it meant for a female subject and how to think about a reconstituted female subject that isn't like the equivalent as, of the male subject, the all-knowing male subject. So Haraway comes up with this idea of a kind of positioned objectivity, which is to say that most knowledge as it's produced through the kind of predominantly rational male sciences don't declare their own self-interest. They produce knowledge as if it's kind of neutral and comes from nowhere. The God trick, I think she calls it. And so what feminism tries to do is say, well, actually, no, these forms of knowledge, which might be very privileged positions, they might be incredibly partial positions, have come from somewhere. They have standpoints and positions. And so that process, as it kind of develops, I mean, there's a kind of whole parallel discussion about feminist positionality and feminist ethnography, and what's called critical ethnography is this self-reflexive turn, that you kind of notice yourself doing things and how you're doing them, which I guess links to, you know, in some ways to Marxist critical theory, and critique has the idea of self-reflection and social emancipation. So you're not doing critique just to self-reflect. It's not like a navel-gazing exercise. It's also with the impulse of emancipation, you know, from capitalism, racism, patriarchy, heterosexism, and so on. So I think that's where the idea, which you described, I think, beautifully, of the co-constituted relationship comes from, which is that it then starts to bring into play the power dynamics that structure research processes. And therefore, yes, one could push into a history that is more participatory, that's pluralistic. In my own work, it would be more along the lines of multiple voices. So I don't tend, you know, some of my work, I've looked at sort of autobiographical methodologies, autoethnographies, as a strand of writing that might sit next to a more classically kind of theoretically distanced form. But in other essays and books, I've worked with kind of many multiple strands, multiple positions of I, and also with the idea more recently that's come out of an area called auto theory, which is less simply life writing or telling the story of one's life, but more the idea that out of experience one can generate concepts. So Sara Ahmed has a brilliant idea of the sweaty concept, which is what comes out of reflecting on difficult experiences with her, its experiences of heterosexism and racism. And someone like Lauren Ballant has this brilliant idea of the situation as something that might come to matter. So in telling a story of experience, one's doing it also to generate philosophy in a way. So it's not like you start with a philosophical position and then illustrate it with an example of a life. It's more that you start with the telling of a story of a life or a set of situated positions, and through that you start to generate conceptual ideas. So I think for me, that idea of a kind of multi-vocal writing is a kind of another side to the situated knowledge for me. So I've kind of moved situated knowledge into a practice that I call sight writing, that both acknowledges the situatedness of the author and how they meet not only their object of study, but also their later reader. And then started to think about the spatial texture of the writing itself and how it can accommodate these different points of view, different materials that one might bring to writing, which could come from found texts, from interviewing people. So you start to produce a more participatory writing. And I suppose I've been most interested in how the mode of writing can pick up and communicate qualities of the object of study. So how can you perform the qualities of an object of study through the writing mode itself? I think that for me is kind of where situated knowledge kind of ends up in my own work.
I really like this use of this word, this spatial texture that you just mentioned, and I'm going to use it as a rather heavy crowbar to introduce the book, The Architecture of Psychoanalysis, Spaces of Transition. Obviously, I think we've got a good sense of the motivations and the kind of direction of this book, but I guess there's more to say about that. I was thinking about the title this morning, and it's kind of interesting because when I read the title first, I thought, this is a book about psychoanalysis and architecture. How do we understand psychoanalysis in architecture? How is psychoanalysis revealed in architecture? But actually, the title suddenly struck me this morning that you might be talking about the superstructure, the foundations of psychoanalysis itself. And you use buildings to actually deliver something that's more weighted towards psychoanalysis in a weird kind of way than towards architecture. That architecture is the tool by which we come to understand psychoanalysis. Is that the wrong? Have I got it the back to front?
No, that's a fascinating interpretation of it. I mean, I think, for my own part, rereading the book in preparation for our conversation, I realized that it is fairly jam-packed, and there's quite a lot that can be drawn out of it. There's a lot going on in that book. I think that would be fair to say. I think there are kind of three strands of inquiry that run parallel in the book. One's a study of spaces of transition in architecture. One's a study of spaces of transition in psychoanalysis, and one's a study of some spaces of transition in my own life as a kind of auto-theoretical strand. The reason that I'm interested in spaces of transition and why I want to look at them through these three different kind of modes is because I've kind of of most of my work has been about transitional spaces, whether it's between disciplines in my book called Art and Architecture, A Place Between, whether it's that role of the hyphen in the sight writing book, so the place, of negotiation between sight and writing. And then, so in the architecture of psychoanalysis, I really wanted to get into that space of transition. And also in the previous book, Sight Writing, which is subtitled The Architecture of Art Criticism, it was a book commissioned by IB Tauris for an art list. So they particularly wanted me to talk about situated criticism in relation to art. And that's what I do in that book. I look at, I take 5 different psychic figurations. Let's say déjà vu is one of them. And each time I look at an artwork, in the case of déjà vu, the work of Christina Iglesias, whose work is all around déjà vu, a particular show she did at the Whitechapel. I then look at the psychoanalytic formulation of déjà vu, and then I produce a piece of kind of creative writing of my own that uses that psychic configuration. Now, interestingly, in sight writing, I don't ever theorize what I mean by configuration. I take it as the structuring device of the book, but I don't theorize it. So 2 things I wanted to do going forward out of that book was A, to start to really understand what is meant by a figural or figuring practice of writing, and also to bring the practice of sight writing into architectural history and theory, and to sort of perform sight writing in relation to an architectural subject. And so I then had this kind of one of those moments where you go, that's, aha moment, where I realized that transitional space is a term that's used to describe the scene of treatment in psychoanalysis. It's a place called the setting, which is where the analyst and analysand meet for treatment in a traditional two-way kind of relationship. There are lots of different types of analysis and therapy. Not all of them are one-on-one. Obviously, there's a lot of family therapy, group therapy that's at play. But in this book, I'm looking at that very Freudian traditional model of the two in a room, the analyst and analysand. And that's described by Donald Winnicott, Andre Green, many other analysts as the setting and as a transitional space, because it's a transitional space that's not only, it's a space between, it's not the outer world, nor is it the inner world of analyst and analysand, but it's a meeting place between them. And actually the analyst Andre Green describes that what the analyst and analysand produce together, the analytic object, is also a kind of transitional space in its own right. So not only is the setting the space that allows that to occur, but the production of the practice of analysis is this analytic object. And at the same time, I'd noticed that the Narkomfin, which is a kind of key building in the history of housing and in Russian social constructivism, that was built in the late 1920s in Russia, was also being described as a transitional space. So it was designed by the architect Mossai Ginsburg, and it was understood to be a kind of type of housing. There was a lot of research that went into these housing types that would allow the new social form of Russian society post the 1918 revolution to become lived. So there's a really interesting kind of question about these buildings, which had some family spaces and some communal spaces, allowing the society to transition to a new way of living. And there's a very interesting conversation in that around, you know, can a building produce a new way of living, or does a new way of living need a new form of architecture, and that kind of dialectic that's at play there, and that society is not quite ready to become fully communist, and so it needs this transitional type of architecture to allow it to do so. Of course, that history unfortunately doesn't really play out in the manner intended, and you know, Stalin comes to power, a lot of the ideas are changed, and even in something like the Narkomfin, many of the features of it, like the pilote, that were kind of borrowed from and referenced from, say, Corbusier and the international movement, have to be kind of boxed in because they're capitalist. So the history doesn't quite play out. But in this early moment, there's this idea of this kind of architectural typology being a transitional type. So I just thought there's a lot here that one could do in the transitional space between a psychoanalytic model of transitional space, the setting, and an architectural model of transitional space in the social condenser.
I like this idea of the setting. I think this is a really interesting idea. And I was wondering, when you talk about that space between the psychoanalyst and the psychoanalysand, which is a new word to me, and I feel very, very grown up saying it. Are we talking here about the physical setting of their chaise longue and straight back chair, or are we talking about the setting of the kind of cultural form that is the psychoanalyst and the cultural form that is the subject of psychoanalysis, the patient, so to speak, or the client, more accurately, I suppose, with psychoanalysis? Is that the setting we're talking about, that when these two people come together in a physical space, they are, to a certain extent, their interrelationship and interaction is produced by the expectations, social expectations of that relationship itself. So in a way, if you go in and there isn't a chaise longue, you're kind of like, is psychotherapy even occurring? Does that make sense? Is it sort of beyond the physical, or is it only the non-physical?
It's both.
Okay.
It's both, and depending on who you read around this, you get slightly different answers. So I think, and this links back to your earlier question about how am I modulating the relationship between psychoanalysis and architecture, which I might answer first to get then to this question you're asking about, is the setting physical, or is it psychic process, or is it social formation? I think that many people in that very productive relationship between architecture and psychoanalysis that was particularly strong in the sort of high theory moments of the late 90s and early 2000s in architecture. Many people have used psychoanalytic theory, be it Freudian, be it Lacanian, to psychoanalyze architecture or to analyze architecture. Lawrence Home, who's a good friend and an amazing thinker, who just has a new book out actually on architecture and Lacan. It would be great to interview him. He's looking at really interesting ideas around ethics and the neighbor, and it's quite a tour de force. It's his second book on architecture and Lacan, so he's really, really getting into some great stuff there. I'm not kind of doing the same type of work. I think what I'm more interested in is how architecture can allow us to think psychoanalysis differently. And as well as allow us to look for things in psychoanalytic theory, for example, the spatial drawings of different psychic concepts like, conscious, pre-conscious, unconscious, or ego, id, superego. Freud does these incredible drawings of these phenomena. So there are sort of spatial diagrams that, by thinking architecturally, one looks at in a different way. I mean, Freud has the most amazing diagram that's actually called The Architecture of Hysteria, which is about different forms of repression, of unconscious material, traumatic material in the unconscious. So architecture helps you think about psychoanalytic drawings, about spatial metaphors in psychoanalysis. For example, Freud uses the idea of the frontier creature to describe the ego as a sort of borderline creature between being told what to do by the superego and trying to stop the id, or the unconscious, the unwanted material, coming to the fore. But I think also what becomes interesting is how one can start to think about the most architectural part of psychoanalysis is probably the setting. So it is the physical place in which that psychoanalytic relationship takes place, but there are lots of different rules governing the setting. There's the time length of how long one is in the space for. I could talk in many different ways about this. It's very, very interesting, the length of time of the psychoanalytic session. There's also arrangements about money, how payment works or doesn't work, and whether there's such a thing as free analysis, which Freud was actually a very strong advocate for. And then there are the kind of techniques of analysis that this private setting, this safe space, it is what we would now call a safe space, a confidential space between the analyst and the analysand, where anything can be said, kind of how that safe space promotes a certain kind of conversation, which Freud says that the key techniques need to be the analysand free associating, so anything that comes to mind, and the analyst doing a kind of what's called freely suspended attentiveness. So careful listening without over-interpretation. And actually, I think it's probably just before starting the book, it'd be interesting to track this history, that I actually began analysis myself as a patient. So, I'd read huge amounts of psychoanalytic theory, which kind of therapist should I go to? Should it be a Lacanian? Should it be a Winnicottian, et cetera, et cetera? And through various fortuitous meetings, I came across an amazing person who I've been working with for the last 10 years. And so I've become much more interested in the actual practice of analysis, like how it really works and what happens in those incredible sessions that you have. I mean, it's a very privileged place to be. And I think that analysis should be open to everyone. I think the world would be in a much, much better place. Winnicott wrote a huge amount of this after the Second World War, if everyone could have psychoanalysis. And there were ideas in the Weimar Republic of analysis being offered out of the back of a van that would just go round to housing places and offer people therapy. And ways to reflect on their lives and to stop the kind of suffering that can happen when trauma is suppressed. So the techniques of analysis, like how much an analyst interprets what an analysand is saying and how much they do what's called construction, like offer back an interpretation. It sounds to me, or this suggests you might be thinking, and that's a massive debate in analysis about how much an analyst puts forward a suggestion. Now, and also within free association, one of the reasons that Freud brings in the couch at the beginning is because it's more like a dream state or sleeping. So you're less controlled by conscious thinking, and you might allow other ways of working that are more to do with reminiscence and memory and remembering dreams or imagining to come into play in that more horizontal position. There's a lot of debate about why in a particular form of analysis, Freudian analysis, the analyst and analysand can't look at each other. And, Freud didn't want to be looked at for long periods of time. But people since then, no, there's actually more technical reasons for this, because if you're actually in a face-to-face relationship, you're much more likely to be monitoring what you're saying, maybe saying things to please someone else. Checking that you fit norms. Whereas if you're not facing someone, you can kind of drift off. And this is where the material that's been repressed might start to come forward in different ways that gives the analyst kind of material to work with.
So beyond the setting itself, beyond the kind of infrastructure of the psychoanalytical moment, the session, to what extent can psychoanalysis be applied to architecture? And I put my notes to you. Architecture is sort of passive, it's a sort of subject. And obviously, as you've pointed out, certain environmental things, and I was thinking about when you were talking about the free association and the possibility of the therapy, the therapized, being able to kind of think clearly. There are implications about what that might mean spatially, aesthetically, in terms of materials, in terms of windows, light, so on and so forth. And I can see that. But you use it on, as you say, this wonderfully famous Narkomfin housing, and also on the Alton estate in London. How do you connect these dots, particularly when you get into London, when you get onto the Alton estate? What is the story that you're telling here? Because alongside this, there's this interspersion of this other story around May Morn, this house that you come across in North London, and the pictures that you find within that, and your considerations, your personal, I suppose, journey in and around this subject. I'm just kind of trying to, I suppose, understand that unpacking. And there is this line that you use, which I think for me was a bit of a light bulb moment. You said to allow for the political unconscious to emerge in architecture. So using a psychoanalysis to allow for the political unconscious. So that's a kind of word salad. There you go. There's a kind of miasma of ideas just thrown at you. I suppose I'm trying to understand how you are deploying this concept, this important, complex, sensitive, thoughtful concept of psychoanalysis into architecture, onto actual buildings, which, as I suggest, I suppose most people would see as being just objects.
No, so yeah, that's the heart of the matter, is it not? Well, I suppose it's trying to deploy that method of free association. So in a way, it's turning the relationship on its head. It's not trying to psychoanalyze the building, because the building, in a sense, isn't a subject. A human subject doesn't have a psyche. It doesn't have an unconscious in that way. It has stories to tell, histories to be uncovered. But I think it's more about thinking about how the building can prompt the experience of the building, visiting a building, its histories and so on, can prompt free association and a more poetic, if you like, kind of way of imagining and remembering that might then tie back into the history in some sense. And that, in a sense, is what we do in the site writing classes that I teach, which is we're kind of combining rational analysis and interpretation in its more conventional hermeneutic mode with a kind of heuristic, a sort of experimental methodology where one through a lot of workshops that we do. We're using free association, bringing in dreams, in memories, in relation to architectural objects to see where it gets us. And that's what I very much do in the book. And I think the May Morn experience was an early version of that, where in walks out of London to the Greenbelt back in 2001 now, my partner and I discovered this arts and crafts house. We think it was kind of a Homes Fit for Heroes bungalow, which the government gave to soldiers returning from the war to have kind of a quiet place to be and grow vegetables and so forth. And this house, very beautiful arts and crafts bungalow, had just been completely covered in vegetation and was open to the elements. And in it, we discovered this, all these architectural journals that had just been rotting, and then this collection of photos that were in a very poor condition, but you could still tell the buildings in them. And then I started this whole process of kind of imagining and wondering what they might be, and then became more of the historian and tried to track down. I mean, they came into my life. I wasn't looking for them. They appeared. I wanted to work with them, but then I kept hold of them for, some 10 years before I actually thought, what are these buildings? I should have known some of them really as an architectural historian. They were these kind of icons of London County Council post-Second World War architecture. And I tracked down most of them, many of them by kind of Google searches and initials of letters in corners of pictures. And the Churchill estate was one that was featured there, the Hallfield estate, and then Alton East and Alton West. And as you said in the book, I kind of moved from the Nakomfin, which was influenced by Courbe, but also influenced the Unité de Marseille, and then how the Unité and its principles influenced Alton West. So there's a sort of architectural tracing there of those kind of that history. But in May Morn, for me, what was kind of fascinating was how the photographs actually showed the buildings at the beginning of their lives. You could still see the scaffolding on them. Some of them had Alton East just been constructed. And yet the buildings were deteriorating. And then, of course, what started to happen as I started to do the research, it was that moment of the beginning of the 100-state demolition plan. So the demolition of social housing like the Haygate and like the Aylesbury. I was living very close by to the Aylesbury at the time. And so I was interested in that word, May Morn, particularly morn, of it being morn for a morning. And later on a return visit to the house in the Greenbelt, I discovered the name of the house was called May Morn, which was like it's a sort of socialist slogan, if you like, the 1st of May being International Labour Day. And so May being a spring month, morn being a morning, a beginning, but also if you add the U, it becomes a mourning and a grieving, actually, for a kind of lost object, which is how I started to feel when I was writing the book, because all these amazing icons, which weren't just beautiful pieces of architecture, but they represented the progressiveness, wouldn't say it's socialist, but the progressiveness of the welfare state after the Second World War, were being demolished or, to build housing and flats that would be costing, the earth and what, Loretta Lees has called super gentrification. And Loretta has her beautiful article called Beverly's Story, actually tells the story of Beverly Robinson, who was one of the last 2 women standing on the Aylesbury at the time, which we were trying to help defend. But actually more recently, unfortunately, that came to end that kind of battle. But the final phase of the Aylesbury, amazing Turkish woman called Aysen, has just won a High Court decision against Southwark for making mistakes in their planning process. So we might be holding on to the Aylesbury for a little longer. So it's more this process of working with what comes to you. And it, for me, some of it turned into, I guess, a form of kind of activism, and then some of it turned more into the more poetic parts of the Architecture of Psychoanalysis book, that third strand, which the whole book is designed as a kind of artifact, as a creative object. It's written in three voices: the psychoanalytic, the architectural, and the autobiographical. The main one story is the autobiographical, but it's also written in phases, and it's designed to fit a 16-page section each time. So every single part of the book, all 15, are double-page spreads with writing on one side, image on the other, in order to create these kind of transitional spaces of reading between image and text. And what I try to do with the captions is I don't use a caption to kind of anchor the meaning in an image. I use it to bring in another meaning. So the caption comes from another part of the book, and that's intentional. That's kind of trying to unsettle the reader and to allow them to free associate, because by putting a caption and an image that don't stick together clearly, you're opening up this third space for someone to kind of wonder, well, how does the caption work with the image? And when the book first came out, a reader wrote to me and said, I'm really sorry to announce to you, but your captions have gone wrong. They don't work. You've made a mistake. And I just said, thank you for telling me, because that's really interesting to know that it can seem like an error. And maybe I felt that was actually fine. I hadn't understood that people would see it as an error, but I am kind of playing with assumptions about what architectural history should do and how it should work.
Yes, there is a sense in it of its policy, of it almost being like an aesthetic enterprise, that criticism in the way that you are using it and the use of images, photographs of details, photographs of people, reproductions of old photographs, fuzzy photographs, and then this beautiful description. I mean, it's a really interesting jump between technical architectural historiography, discussions around the literature of psychoanalysis, and then these kind of personal and self-revelatory issues around Maimon, for example. And I did wonder whether, to a certain extent, and I don't know who said this, if anybody said this, a sort of psychoanalysis is much closer to a form of literature than it is to a form of science. And that insofar as that is true, what you are undertaking in this book seems to me to be an aesthetic or an aestheticization of the psychoanalytical process. A sort of way of both embodying psychoanalysis in materials, like literally in concrete, and then using that as a way of, I suppose, casting beauty on it in a strange sort of way, using it as it becomes almost like an emancipatory device, rather than this medicalized process that is undertaken when you're in trouble. It comes back to your point about the idea of psychoanalysis being a common good that should be delivered in an egalitarian fashion. And your book kind of plays that game, I think, for me. It's generous in that way. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, I love it I really love that as a reflection, as a reader's reflection, because I think that, yes, I think, there's a lot of struggle with psychoanalytic literature. I have to say, I found a lot of psychoanalytic theory quite difficult to understand and sort of apply. Mm-hmm. But actually, the process of analysis, although it's hard to just keep coming back to talking and reflecting, there's a certain kind of joy in it, in that you're hopefully opening up creativity. That's certainly how I would see it. You're coming back to earlier scenes from different directions, from seeing things from other points of view, remembering things in different ways. And so I think it does, for me anyway, free up creativity, loosen up creativity. And I think one of the strands, we've not really discussed it, but which is very important in the book, which in a way is also an early idea of how I moved into it, was the idea of the lost object. Everyone's constantly losing keys and wallets and goodness knows what. But I also know that I get a bit fixated on, a lost book, or where did I put this? And the idea of the sort of lost object as part of a kind of yearning, I think there's been quite, and me, focusing on the book on the potential loss of social housing, fits into both, discussions about the difference between mourning and melancholia in Freud, where mourning is an active process of grieving, but when it becomes melancholic and starts to eat into the grieving person, he sees it as a neurosis, which today we might describe as depression.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, I think that practices that might seem like a mourning, like nostalgia, a yearning for the better days, in the work of someone like Frederick Jameson, he's saying, no, it doesn't have to be regressive. It could be that we go back to a better time because it offers things that we need for today that are, socially much more progressive. So I think there's a kind of hope in nostalgia about moving into better times. And for me, I think the aesthetic process, the creative process offers some of that.
Is the lost object in psychoanalysis used in that way? Is it, because weirdly enough, I was thinking about this just yesterday, about how human beings all tend to look back to their teenage years and say that these were the glory days. These were the best days in the history of the world. The music was better, the art was better, the food was better, all of the stuff. It has to be untrue for somebody. But
I mean, it's the kind of loss of the first carer, in traditional psychoanalysis, much of it up until Melanie Klein, written by Mann, would be the loss of the mother as carer. But Klein then looks properly at the relationship of the mother and the child, and the mother in the child's development. So yeah, it's the mourning for early loss, if you like, and the reason Winnicott is such an important thinker, and British object relations is sort of different in this to Freud and Freud's work, is that it does place real emphasis not on the Oedipal complex, but on the mother-child relationship. And for today, we would have to think about the relationship with the early carers, about how people caring for a child in the early days, they have an amazing job in a way, which is to allow children not to suffer the kind of loss, but to actually individuate and to find their own creativity and their own social transformation into society and social life. And that's why Winnicott calls the lost object the transitional object, because he's looking at the way that children use kind of toys to mediate the absence of the mother. And the whole, transitional space in itself in Freud is described as the Borda game. So it's this idea of the child throwing a cotton reel out and then pulling it back in order to kind of come to terms with his mother going and coming back. Could that going away be a going away forever? Or not. So it's trying to come to terms with early loss, I think. But the transitional object just holds that potential of creativity, and that's why Andre Green's such an interesting thinker, because he's trying to bring together Freudian ideas and Winnicott's ideas. And looking at the transitional space as what he calls a triangular structure with variable thirds. And the third in the relationship between either mother and child, father and child, or analyst and analysand, in what they make together. In analysis, it's the analytic object. But Green says, no, in society, in the world, it's the creative object. It's music, it's art. That's what's made creativity in a way.
I just want to ask one last question to go back, sort of to take it back to the beginning of our conversation around your, should we say, architectural heritage. My wife has been reading again the quadrilogy by the author Marian Robinson. And she's been thinking about, and we have a wee house with our children, and she's been thinking about the way that the home and the woman co-constitute each other, how the home becomes both the framework of the work of the woman, the domestic work of the woman. My wife is a stay-at-home mum at the moment, largely. So the way that the woman produces the environment in which she can work, and the way that the home itself or the building itself produces the work that she can do. And it's a really interesting binary relationship. I was wondering, and I think it's fascinating, and I love it because it endows buildings with character. It endows architecture with personhood in a way. I mean, it's a tendency of humans, obviously, to do that, to that anthropomorphism. But I was wondering in your book whether you felt in your studies of these particular examples there was also an attempt to reflect upon their capacity as enablers or inhibitors of female identity within space, both domestic space, but also in urban and social space. Is that something that has underpinned this kind of writing as a way of kind of, I suppose, emancipating architecture from the rather tyrannous high modernist idea of the architect's, the male architect's intentions?
Interesting, very interesting. I mean, unexpected kind of consequences of the book is that I spent my architectural education as quite a cross-feminist, not very happy about being told to only study male masters. So one of the things in the book is that I don't begin by setting out my intentions, but it's the final part of the book, afterwards in particular, that talk about kind of what happened in the book and what I kind of learned and what came up. And one of the things that came up was that I found myself studying Le Corbusier, who I'd rejected studying at Sheffield and then at Edinburgh. And I particularly rejected in the teachings of Izzy Metstein, who was someone who he's died many years ago now, was an amazing architectural educator who worked with Gillespie, Kidd and Goya and used a lot of Corb's ideas in Cardross, in St. Peter's Seminary there. And I remember kind of refusing to go on the school visit because I didn't want to study a male master. So with a male master, study the work of a male master with a male master. So I found in the book that perhaps there was a kind of release where I was allowing myself to study Corb and actually finding it pretty interesting in terms of the spatial capacities and incredible inventiveness of kind of his section in the Unité, which is a kind of extraordinary thing. But I think that I was actually thinking today, I don't think, so it might have been quite liberatory for me, but I think that there's as a feminist historian to say, well, it's okay, I can go back and look at these kind of male masters and learn from them now. But I think that I don't pay enough attention necessarily to the female figures involved in these stories. In fact, a new book I want to work on is going back to look at some female figures in the lives of Roland Barthes, Henri Lefebvre, and Walter Benjamin, a story about another space that I'm very closely connected to in the Pyrenees. But in that book, no, I don't. And in fact, one of my amazing master's students has just done a brilliant dissertation on Rosemary Sternstedt, who was the architectural designer of Alton East. And I noticed, I just checked my book today, she's in a footnote, but she's not a major part of the text. So I think it's still a very male-dominated story. And I think there could be a lot more to be said, both about the kind of female influences. So, for example, I don't talk about any female psychoanalysts, apart from Rosine Perelberg, who is an amazing analyst and theoretician. She's written huge and great volumes on the temporality of the session, a psychoanalytic session. But I don't refer to Klein. Jessica Benjamin, I do refer to, but not, largely. So I think it's still quite a male story, but I think potentially it opens up avenues of exploration that hopefully other scholars may come and pick up on. I mean, I think my colleague Victor Booth, an anthropologist at UCL, he wrote his whole, I think it was his PhD, so also a Russian speaker, on a kind of ethnography of the Narcomphin, which I would really, really recommend. And you start to get a sense in his book about female life in the Narcomphin in the early days. So if people are interested in that, will definitely go to that, and will definitely go to this amazing dissertation on Rosemary Sternstedt by Flo Armitage Hooks. So I think it's a really important question that you're asking. I would say that I would actually have to say no. I think there's a bit more work that needs to be done there, which is always probably the best place to be.
For sure. Thank you very much, Jane. That's a great point to finish on.
Thanks so much. It's been really great to talk to you.
They are still alive, but in a world he changed simply by looking back with no false regrets. All he did was to remember like the old and be honest like children. He wasn't clever at all. He merely told the unhappy present to recite the past like a poetry lesson till sooner or later it faltered at the line where, long ago, the accusations had begun. That's what Whiston said about Sigmund. I think it's nice. Thanks to Jane for taking the time to speak with me. It was an enormous pleasure and a privilege. Please see the podcast descriptions for links to Jane's professional profile and to the book. And thanks for listening.